Why OLED and even with the RetroTINK 4K isn't like something that will give you the perfect retro gaming experience. Maybe for some of you, yes, and probably even for 90% of people this will be enough. But there's one thing related to the CRT motion clarity compared to OLED that makes a big difference, at least for some. So when you talk about this, let's say 0.1 millisecond lie in quotation. So you bought an OLED TV, the box says 0.1 millisecond response time. Now that's basically instant. So why is it that when you boot, for example, up your Super Mario World or play another side-scroller game, it can actually look like a blurry mess compared to your old tube TV. You see, until now I was playing on modern display with different shaders, try to get this CRT effect. I didn't even want to jump into CRT. It's just too much to do, and I didn't think that it's just going to be a huge difference. Well, it only took me just visiting the store and seeing a certain display to decide that, well, something is not right here. I wasn't supposed to feel like that. I wasn't supposed to feel different, and I wasn't supposed to go that route, and eventually I bought a CRT display. Now, we've probably been told that OLED is the perfect display tech, and for contrast, it is. But for motion clarity, there's a massive misunderstanding in the gaming community. So today we're going to fix that, at least for those who have some misinformation, or maybe I would say high expectations to certain solutions. So we're going to explain why fast pixel don't equal clear motion. Now, the method behind why you need, for example, let's say 1000 frames per second to beat the CRT naturally, and how devices like the RetroTINK 4K, for example, use Genlock and BFI to bridge the gap. BFI stands for Black Frame Insertion. Now what you see here is just for illustration purposes, of course. You need to see things on CRT to fully, of course, comprehend this. But in general, there are two types of response time. Again, we call it in quotation. So you're actually, if you are reading response times, you might be confused with something called persistence. So pixel response is how fast a pixel changes color. On an OLED, this is indeed, for example, like 0.1 millisecond. It prevents ghosting or trails behind objects, or better to say, moving objects. Now, persistence, or MPRT, is how long the pixel stays visible on your eyeball, on your retina. So on a standard 60 Hz OLED, that frame sits on your retina for around 16.7 milliseconds. Now, that sounds fast, right? It's not. There's a rule known as Buster's law. It stated that 1 millisecond of persistence creates 1 pixel of motion blur. Now you can check it out yourself if you go to this URL address at under testufo.com. You can see that even then it says 1 millisecond of frame visibility time equals 1 pixel of display motion blur per 1000 pixels a second. And also say in line 1, you can see even at 0 millisecond gray to gray response, most display motion blur is from eye tracking on sample and hold displays. You can see it also says that above this effect, modern sample and hold displays such as LCD and OLED, all flicker-free displays are subject to a sample and hold effect that creates display motion blur. So even with your fast OLED with 60 millisecond of persistence, fast motion creates 16 pixels of smear. This is why if you play games like Sonic, for example, like sometimes the background can look like watercolor painting. On a CRT, the electron gun flashes for 1 millisecond and then goes black. 1 millisecond persistent equal 1 pixel of blur. This is effectively perfect clarity. So with the CRT's electron beam impulse, the image flashes briefly for 1 millisecond, and your brain bridges the gap, resulting in sharp motion clarity without smear. So how do we fix this? Well, this is the 1000 Hz problem. Well, there are two main things. First of all, using the brute force method. This is naturally get persistence down to 1 millisecond on sample and hold display. For this, you need to a monitor running at 1000 Hz playing a game at 1000 frames per second. Now, if you go from a modern PC game perspective, you say, all right, just run the game, this old game, they will run in 10,000 frames per second. With modern graphics card. These are ancient games. Or just, get a higher refresh rate monitor and at least get very close to it. Well, if you had a 1000 Hz monitor running a game at 1000 FPS, the blur would disappear naturally. Now, there's a problem for us for retro gamers. you cannot run Super Mario World at 1000 FPS. Retro games are hard-coded to run at 60 FPS. Their internal logic, physics, and speed are tied to that number. Now, of course, you can do something like adding like frame generation and add frames to increase the frame rate, like we have, for example, with many NVIDIA games that are optimized for high frame rate using DLSS 4 or DLSS 3. But again, this adds lags anyway. Now let's say that you plug a Super Nintendo into futuristic 1000 Hz monitor. The screen will just display the exact same frame 60 times in a row while waiting for the console to send the next one. Because that image remains static on the screen for the full 60 milliseconds, your eye still smears it. You gain absolutely nothing. Now there is an option B, which is more viable and practical. And this is the Black Frame Insertion, BFI. And since we are stuck again at 60 FPS, we have to cheat. We use the Black Frame Insertion, BFI, and we flash the image for that magical 1 millisecond window and then force the screen to be black for the rest of the time. Now this mimics the CRT strobe effect. It effectively wipes your vision clean 60 times a second, but it kills your brightness, which is why we need advanced scalers to fix it. This is also why people recommend an OLED with a very bright maximum brightness, and also why this thing works better when you have an HDR display and you can actually take advantage of higher maximum brightness of your display. Now this brings us to the heavy artillery, the RetroTINK 4K. Does the RetroTINK make the games run smoother? Well, the answer is no, but also yes. So let's be clear here. The RetroTINK cannot change the game's frame rate. Star Fox, for example, will run at 20 FPS. Sonic will always be 60 FPS. However, it does change the video signal hertz sent to your TV. Now, Genlock versus triple buffer old consoles are weird. A Super Nintendo, for example, doesn't run at 60 Hz. It runs at 60.09 Hz. A Genesis runs at 59.92 Hz. Now, most modern TVs freak out at these numbers. So the RetroTINK has two modes. Triple buffer, this forces the signal to a standard 60 Hz, so your TV is happy. The downside, every 10 seconds, the speeds mismatch, and you get kind of tiny stutter or hiccup in scrolling. Well, the solution for this is called Genlock, which is this is a pro mode, and you can find it on certain displays, especially professional and broadcasting displays. So what the RetroTINK can do here is output the exact read speed of the console, let's say 60.09 Hz, if your TV supports it, and LG OLEDs, for example, usually do, but make sure to check it out, and you're gonna get perfectly smooth scrolling with zero stutter, just like a CRT. Now there's also the 120 Black Frame Insertion trick. So if you want to use the Black Frame Insertion to kill that motion blur, the RetroTINK takes that 60 Hz signal and doubles it to 120 Hz. It goes game frame and then black frame and then game frame and then black frame. So the game still feels like 60 FPS. But because of those black gaps, your brain stops mirroring the motion. Again, this is similar to how we perceive it when you play on a CRT display. Now combine this with HDR injection to pump the brightness back up, and you have the closest thing you can get to a CRT, well, possibly today. Of course, new technology can be introduced to improve it even more. So, is it good enough? Well, if you understand the tech, and if you use, for example, Genlock for smooth scrolling and 120 Hz Black Frame Insertion to lower that persistence to 1 millisecond, then yes, you get the ink black levels of OLED and the motion clarity of a tube. Of course, there are many other things that can affect, of course, the visual experience, but in this specific aspect, when it comes to motion clarity, there are ways to improve it quite significantly to get very close to the performance that you get from the CRT displays. So Black Frame Insertion is effectively the close enough solution for, let's say, 90% of people, but for purists, it's not quite the same as a real CRT. That's for sure. And also the price together can be very expensive. If you go, for example, OLED direction with the RetroTINK 4K, the price can be very high. But there are pros and cons for each one, and it's up to you to decide which one you prefer. Just talking about motion clarity here, what are your thoughts in the comment section below? And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you in advance. See you in the next video. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.